Hi there, Andy again from UK Beer Reviews. Just want to make a quick, quick video really, just to talk about craft beers. That, like my little friend here, craft beers seem to be all the rage now, but it's worth noting that actually craft beers aren't anything new, and they've been around for the last. Beer's been around definitely for the last 10,000 years BC, and they were craft breweries, really. There were small independent brewers that they used to just brew their local brew, and I suppose technically nowadays you'd kind of call it a craft. Back in the day, back in the UK, back in the early days of pubs and brewing in the UK, pubs used to brew their own beer, so they were technically craft ales. And it wasn't until about the 18th century when bigger brewers came in with better technology, better ways of production, and they actually started to brew big batches of beer and reduce the price of beer. And then pubs started to look at that and go, actually, rather than the expense of making it ourselves, we can buy it from these big brewers and we can actually save money on the buying of the beers and make money then more profits on the actual selling of it. So that's what happened. As the price came down, more people started buying from these big breweries, and this concept of craft ales seemed to disappear a little bit. If you look back at the British colonies, way back in the day when we roamed the world and areas around the world were taken up with British colonies around there was a requirement, a need for people to still consume beer and the British beer they've been brought up with. But you needed something that could be easier to store, easier to transport around the place. And this concept of IPA, or an India Pale Ale, actually started that's the way it was all designed. It's mainly because they designed a beer that would keep well in lots of different conditions. IPA was the biggest beer sold in the world until the Czechs and the Germans started to produce their own lagers of pilsners, and they became more fashionable. And again, your big brew houses started to take over those productions. But there's still some strongholds, and British towns and Belgian monasteries and those sorts of people hung on to beer and tried to repel as much as possible this idea of lagers from Europe. And so beers were still being brewed. Back in the US, they had prohibition where you weren't allowed to make or sell alcohol. Actually, it's an interesting story that prohibition was repealed in 1933, but it wasn't until 1979 in the US, because of the administration error, that in 1979, people in America were allowed to make their own homebrew. That had been completely forgotten when the laws in 1933 were repealed. So suddenly in America, you had lots of people, lots of small brewers, actually realising now they can brew their own stuff, and they started to do just that. And so you started to get this idea of small independent brewers all over again. And what was interesting about the American model is they didn't want the beer and the lager that had been made from the big brewers in America. So they started to look elsewhere, and they picked on this old recipes and these old styles, these IPAs, and that's what they run with. They liked those British hops, and they started to use those and started mixing them with American hops. Back over in the UK, in Britain, we started to look at what America were doing with their American pale ales and their New England pale ales, for example. And we decided to use some of their American hops in our own beers. And suddenly you got this whole craft beer market starting to open up, and this movement was absolutely massive. There's some changes in UK duty in the UK in 2002, and that made it possible for smaller brewers to start doing their bit in the UK as well. Brewdog then started to do their thing, and they launched in 2007, and they brought a brand new business model to the market to say, actually, for craft beers, you can, as a brewer, start to make money using craft beers. And since then, the whole thing's taken off, and craft brew, rather than disappearing, is actually always been there and probably always will do. There, a little potted history of craft brewing for you.